the 22nd of June, 1941. It's a Sunday morning, and across an enormous front stretching nearly 2,000 miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, the most massive invasion in human history is about to begin. In the pre-dawn darkness, along the western borders of the Soviet Union, more than 3.5 million German and Axis soldiers stand ready. Behind them, over 3,000 tanks and nearly as many aircraft wait to unleash a storm of steel and fire. The soldiers check their weapons one final time. Officers synchronize their watches, artillery crews prepare their guns. And then, at precisely 3:15 in the morning, the silence shatters. Thousands of artillery pieces open fire simultaneously, their thunder rolling across the landscape like an approaching apocalypse. The shells scream through the air, crashing into Soviet border positions, fortifications, and military installations. Minutes later, the Luftwaffe roars overhead in massive formations, their bombers heading deep into Soviet territory to strike airfields, communication centers, and troop concentrations. On the ground, Panzer divisions surge forward, their tracks churning up the earth as they begin what Adolf Hitler believes will be a swift and decisive campaign to crush the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa has begun. For the German dictator, this moment represents the culmination of years of ideological obsession and strategic calculation. Hitler had always viewed the Soviet Union as Germany's natural enemy, a vast empire ruled by what he considered the twin evils of Bolshevism and Judaism. More than that, he saw the Soviet territories as Lebensraum, living space that the German people needed for their future expansion and prosperity. The Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact signed in August 1939 had been, in Hitler's mind, nothing more than a temporary tactical maneuver, a convenient arrangement that allowed Germany to secure its eastern flank while dealing with France and Britain in the west. Now, with Western Europe largely subdued, Hitler was ready to pursue his ultimate goal, the destruction of the Soviet state and the subjugation of its people. The German plan was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its execution. 3 massive army groups would strike simultaneously across the front. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, would drive toward Leningrad, Russia's second city and a vital port. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would sweep through Ukraine, seizing its rich agricultural lands and industrial resources. But it was Army Group Center, led by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, that had the most critical objective. This powerful force, comprising the bulk of Germany's panzer divisions, would smash through the Soviet defenses and drive straight for Moscow, the Soviet capital and the political, economic, and transportation heart of Stalin's empire. The German High Command expected the campaign to last no more than 3 to 4 months. They believed that the Red Army, weakened by Stalin's brutal purges of its officer corps in the late 1930s, would crumble under the onslaught of German blitzkrieg tactics. Initial intelligence suggested the Soviets had about 150 divisions in the western regions of the country, and German planners estimated they might raise perhaps 50 more. What they didn't realize was that the Soviet capacity for mobilization and the Soviet people's will to resist would far exceed their calculations. What they couldn't foresee was that this invasion would lead them into the largest and most brutal military campaign in human history. A struggle that would ultimately cost millions of lives and determine the fate of the Second World War. But on this June morning, as German tanks rolled across the border and Soviet positions erupted in flames, victory seemed assured. The Wehrmacht was at the peak of its power, its soldiers hardened by 2 years of almost uninterrupted triumph across Europe. They had crushed Poland in weeks, overrun France in a matter of months, and swept through the Balkans with seemingly effortless ease. Now, they were bringing this same devastating force to bear against what they saw as an inferior enemy. The road to Moscow, they believed, lay open before them. The blitzkrieg unleashed. The Soviet forces stationed along the western frontier never stood a chance, caught completely off guard by the timing and ferocity of the German assault. Despite numerous warnings that an attack was imminent, the Red Army reeled under the hammer blows of the Wehrmacht. Within hours of the invasion's start, the Luftwaffe had achieved air supremacy, destroying thousands of Soviet aircraft, many of them caught on the ground, lined up in neat rows on their airfields like targets in a shooting gallery. Without air cover, Soviet ground forces found themselves at the mercy of German dive bombers and fighters, which struck with devastating precision at command posts, supply depots, and troop concentrations. On the ground, the German panzer divisions demonstrated the blitzkrieg tactics that had brought them such spectacular success in the West. Fast-moving armored spearheads punched through Soviet defensive lines, bypassing strong points and driving deep into the rear areas. Behind them came motorized infantry and follow-up forces that would engage and destroy the bypassed Soviet units. The goal was not simply to push the enemy back, but to encircle and annihilate entire Soviet armies before they could retreat and regroup. And in the early weeks of the campaign, this strategy worked with terrifying effectiveness. The scale of Soviet losses in these first encounters defied comprehension. Entire armies found themselves surrounded in vast pockets, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, subjected to relentless attacks from ground and air. At Białystok and Minsk, German pincers closed around hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. At Smolensk, another massive encirclement netted even more prisoners. By the end of July, the Germans had captured over 1 million Soviet soldiers and destroyed thousands of tanks and artillery pieces. The Red Army appeared to be on the verge of total collapse. Army Group North made rapid progress toward Leningrad, covering over 400 miles in the first month and reaching within striking distance of the city by early September. Army Group South, though initially slowed by stronger Soviet resistance in Ukraine, eventually broke through and captured Kiev, the capital of Soviet Ukraine, in a massive encirclement that netted over 600,000 prisoners. But it was Army Group Center that achieved the most spectacular advances. By mid-July, von Bock's forces had crossed the Dnieper River and were approaching Smolensk, just 200 miles from Moscow. The capture of Smolensk on July 16th seemed to confirm that the road to the Soviet capital lay open. Yet even as German soldiers celebrated these victories, troubling signs began to emerge. Despite the staggering losses they had suffered, the Soviets kept bringing up fresh reserves. New armies appeared where German intelligence had insisted none existed. Soviet soldiers, though often poorly equipped and badly led, fought with a ferocity and determination that surprised and unnerved many German troops. The vast distances of Russia, far greater than anything the Wehrmacht had encountered in Western Europe, stretched German supply lines to the breaking point. Tanks and trucks broke down from constant use on primitive roads. Fuel and ammunition had to be transported hundreds of miles from railheads, and the summer heat, combined with the clouds of dust raised by advancing columns, created conditions that wore down both men and machines. More ominously, Hitler began to waver in his strategic priorities. His generals, particularly Chief of the Army General Staff Franz Halder and von Bock himself, urged him to maintain the focus on Moscow. The Soviet capital, they argued, was not just a symbolic prize but a crucial objective. It was the center of the Soviet rail network, the hub of the country's communications, and the political heart of Stalin's regime. Its fall might well bring about the collapse of Soviet resistance. But Hitler disagreed. He believed that economic targets were more important than purely military ones. He wanted to seize the agricultural wealth of Ukraine and secure the oil fields of the Caucasus. He also wanted to eliminate the Soviet forces threatening Army Group Center's flanks. In August, to the dismay of his generals, Hitler ordered the two panzer groups of Army Group Center to halt their advance on Moscow and divert their forces north and south. The 3rd Panzer Group would support Army Group North's drive on Leningrad. The 2nd Panzer Group, under the command of the brilliant but controversial General Heinz Guderian, would wheel south to help Army Group South complete the encirclement of Kiev. For nearly 2 months, the drive on Moscow came to a standstill while these operations were completed. The delay would prove catastrophic for German hopes of capturing the Soviet capital before winter. Operation Typhoon, the final gamble. By late September 1941, with Kiev captured and the situation around Leningrad stabilized, Hitler finally gave the order for Army Group Center to resume its advance on Moscow. The operation, codenamed Typhoon, would be the largest and most powerful offensive the Wehrmacht had yet launched. Von Bock assembled an overwhelming force for the assault, 75 divisions, including 14 panzer and 8 motorized divisions, comprising nearly 2 million men. 3 of Germany's 4 panzer groups were concentrated for this single operation. The Luftwaffe's Second Air Fleet, with over 1,000 aircraft, would provide air support. It was, by any measure, a formidable striking force. Facing this juggernaut were 3 Soviet fronts: the Western Front under General Ivan Konev, the Reserve Front under Marshal Semyon Budyonny, and the Bryansk Front under General Andrei Yeremenko, with a combined strength of about 1.25 million men. The Soviet forces had spent the 2-month pause preparing defensive positions along multiple lines stretching from Vyazma in the north to Bryansk in the south. But they were spread thin, and Soviet intelligence had failed to detect the true strength and direction of the coming German assault. Operation Typhoon began on September 30th with Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group attacking the Bryansk front from the south. 2 days later, on October 2nd, the main German forces crashed into the Western and Reserve fronts. The Germans had carefully reconnoitered the Soviet positions and identified weak points at the boundaries between Soviet armies. Instead of attacking along the most direct route to Moscow via the Minsk-Moscow highway, where the strongest Soviet defenses had been prepared, the panzer spearheads struck at these vulnerable junctures, achieving complete tactical surprise. The German breakthrough was swift and devastating. With their superior training, coordination, and tactical skill, the panzer divisions sliced through Soviet defenses like a hot knife through butter. Within days, German armored spearheads were racing deep into the Soviet rear, bypassing strong points and heading for their link-up points. Behind them, Soviet armies found themselves cut off, surrounded, and struggling to maintain any kind of coherent defense. The Luftwaffe, dominating the skies, pounded Soviet positions mercilessly, while also interdicting Soviet attempts to move reserves or supplies to the front. By October 7th, the jaws of the German trap snapped shut near Vyazma as elements of the 3rd and 4th Panzer Groups linked up, creating a massive pocket that contained the bulk of 4 Soviet armies, the 19th, 20th, 24th, and 32nd, along with elements of other formations. To the south, near Bryansk, another encirclement was forming as Guderian's panzers and elements of the 2nd Army surrounded the Soviet 3rd and 13th Armies, along with the 50th Army. The twin encirclements of Vyazma and Bryansk rank among the largest in military history, trapping hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers in desperate pockets where escape seemed impossible. Inside these cauldrons, Soviet commanders tried desperately to organize breakouts, while their men fought with whatever they had. Artillery ammunition ran low, then ran out entirely. Fuel for tanks and vehicles was quickly exhausted. Food became scarce. Yet despite the hopelessness of their situation, many Soviet units continued to resist, tying down German divisions that were needed for the advance on Moscow. Some formations attempted mass breakouts, sometimes succeeding in small groups, but often suffering catastrophic casualties. The encircled Soviet soldiers were buying time with their lives, time that would prove precious for the defense of Moscow. The German propaganda machine proclaimed the imminent fall of Moscow. On October 9th, Otto Dietrich, speaking for the German Ministry of Propaganda and quoting Hitler himself, announced to foreign correspondents that the Soviet armies defending the capital had been destroyed and that the collapse of Soviet resistance was perhaps only hours away. After all, German forces had captured between 500,000 and 670,000 prisoners in the twin battles, along with over 1,000 tanks and hundreds of artillery pieces. The road to Moscow appeared to lie open, defended by only the shattered remnants of Soviet forces. But appearances were deceiving. While the encirclements had indeed been catastrophic for the Red Army, they had not destroyed Soviet capacity to resist. Stalin, in a display of the ruthlessness that characterized his rule, was already mobilizing new armies from the interior of the country. Divisions were being rushed from Siberia and Central Asia. Reserves were being called up. Militia units were being formed from factory workers and citizens of Moscow itself. And crucially, the trapped Soviet soldiers in the Vyazma and Bryansk pockets were not surrendering quietly. Their stubborn resistance was delaying the German advance, giving Moscow precious days and weeks to prepare its defenses. The mud and the cold. As October wore on, a new enemy emerged to challenge the German advance, one that would prove more implacable than even the most determined Soviet resistance: the Russian weather. The autumn rains came early and heavy that year, turning the primitive Russian roads into rivers of mud. The Germans had a word for it: the Rasputitsa, the quagmire season, and it brought their mechanized armies grinding to a halt more effectively than any Soviet counterattack could have done. German tanks designed for the paved roads of Western Europe found themselves struggling in conditions their designers had never imagined. The narrow tracks that gave German panzers their speed and maneuverability on firm ground became liabilities in the Russian mud. Tanks sank up to their hulls in the churning morass, wheels spun uselessly, half-tracks and trucks became hopelessly bogged down. Even horse-drawn transport, on which the Wehrmacht still relied heavily for moving supplies, struggled in the endless mud. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Wagons broke axles. The entire German logistics system, already strained by the vast distances and primitive infrastructure, came close to complete breakdown. For the German soldiers themselves, the Rasputitsa was a miserable ordeal. They slogged through knee-deep mud, their boots sucked off their feet, their uniforms soaked and caked with muck. Vehicles that became stuck had to be manhandled out of the mud or simply abandoned. Supplies that would normally move quickly by truck now had to be carried forward by hand. The advance that had been measured in miles per day now slowed to a crawl, measured in yards. And always the rains continued, cold and relentless, a foretaste of the winter that was coming. By late October, Field Marshal von Bock was forced to order a temporary halt to the offensive. His armies needed time to reorganize, to bring up supplies, to repair or replace worn-out vehicles and equipment. The pause lasted nearly 2 weeks, from late October into mid-November. During this time, the Germans struggled to prepare for what they knew was coming: the Russian winter. But adequate preparations proved impossible. The Wehrmacht had launched Operation Barbarossa, expecting to win before winter set in. Winter clothing, cold weather lubricants for weapons and vehicles, antifreeze for engines, none of these things had been stockpiled in sufficient quantities or distributed to the frontline units. The Soviets, meanwhile, were using the pause to good advantage. General Georgy Zhukov, one of Stalin's most capable commanders, had been recalled from Leningrad and placed in overall command of the Western Front, defending Moscow. Zhukov was a hard man, brutal in his methods, but brilliant in his operational planning. He understood that time was now working in favor of the defense. Every day that passed saw new units arrive to strengthen Moscow's defenses. Every day saw more fortifications constructed, more obstacles prepared, more guns sighted to cover the approaches to the capital. The Soviet defenders were building multiple defensive belts around Moscow. The outermost line ran through the cities of Kalinin, Volokolamsk, and Kaluga. Behind this was the Mozhaisk defense line, anchored on the cities of Mozhaisk, Maloyaroslavets, and Tula. Closer to Moscow itself, additional defense lines were being constructed by workers and soldiers laboring around the clock. Anti-tank ditches were dug, concrete bunkers were built, artillery positions were prepared, barricades went up in the streets of Moscow's suburbs. The city was being transformed into a fortress. Stalin himself remained in Moscow, a decision that did much to steady Soviet morale. Many government offices were evacuated to Kuibyshev, hundreds of miles to the east, and Lenin's embalmed body was removed from its mausoleum in Red Square and sent to safety. But Stalin stayed, appearing at the traditional November 7th parade in Red Square to commemorate the October Revolution, reviewing troops who would march directly from Red Square to the front lines. His presence in the capital sent a clear message: Moscow would be defended. There would be no surrender. The November Offensive, a final push through hell. When the ground finally froze hard in mid-November, making movement possible again, the Germans launched their final attempt to take Moscow. On November 15th, Army Group Center resumed its offensive with every available unit. The plan called for a massive double envelopment of the Soviet capital. The 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies would attack north of Moscow, cross the Moscow-Volga Canal, and sweep around the city from the northeast. The 2nd Panzer Army would attack from the south, capture the industrial city of Tula, and then wheel north toward Moscow. These two powerful armored thrusts would meet east of Moscow, encircling the city and trapping its defenders. Meanwhile, the Fourth Army would attack directly from the west, pinning down Soviet forces and preventing them from reinforcing against the envelopments. It was an ambitious plan, perhaps too ambitious given the condition of German forces. The men were exhausted after months of continuous combat and marching. They were inadequately clothed for the plummeting temperatures. Many soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets or wore civilian clothes scavenged from villages over their uniforms. Some cut up carpets or tablecloths to wrap around their feet. Equipment was breaking down at an alarming rate. Tanks and vehicles designed for the moderate climate of Central Europe were failing in the brutal cold. Engine blocks cracked as temperatures dropped. Lubricants froze. Weapons malfunctioned. Yet despite these handicaps, the German armies attacked with the skill and determination that had brought them victory across Europe. In the north, the 3rd and 4th Panzer armies broke through Soviet defensive positions and advanced toward the Moscow-Volga Canal. Town after town fell to the Germans. Klin was captured on November 23rd after bitter fighting. Solnechnogorsk fell the next day. Istra, site of one of Moscow's water reservoirs, was taken on November 24th. The 4th Panzer Army pushed forward relentlessly, its commanders sensing that Moscow was within their grasp. By late November, German units had crossed the Moscow-Volga Canal at several points and were fighting in the northern suburbs of Moscow itself. To the south, however, the offensive was stalling. The 2nd Panzer Army's attempt to capture Tula ran into fierce resistance from the city's defenders, who had converted it into a fortress. Guderian's panzers, the same divisions that had raced across France and deep into Russia earlier in the campaign, found themselves unable to crack the Soviet defenses. The soldiers holding Tula, a mix of regular army units, NKVD troops, militia, and armed workers, fought with desperate determination. They knew that if Tula fell, the road to Moscow from the south would be open. Day after day, the Germans attacked. Day after day, they were thrown back with heavy casualties. The cold was becoming unbearable. Temperatures plunged to -20, -30, even -40 degrees Celsius on the worst nights. German soldiers who had fought in Poland and France, who had marched through the summer heat of Ukraine, now found themselves in conditions they had never imagined. Frostbite became epidemic. Men lost fingers, toes, sometimes entire hands or feet to the cold. Sentries froze to death at their posts. Wounded men who couldn't reach shelter died within hours. The very act of staying alive required constant effort, burning calories that underfed soldiers didn't have to spare. The German vehicles and weapons suffered as much as the men. Tanks wouldn't start in the morning, their engines frozen solid, despite all efforts to keep them warm. Machine guns jammed because their lubricants had turned to sludge. Artillery pieces froze in place. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated the skies since the start of Barbarossa, found its operations severely curtailed. Aircraft engines wouldn't start. Fuel froze in tanks and lines. Ground crews worked in conditions that turned routine maintenance into a battle for survival. Sorties that would have been routine in summer became dangerous gambles in winter. Against this backdrop of cold and exhaustion, the Germans pushed on. Their generals knew this was their last chance. If they couldn't take Moscow now, before the full fury of winter set in, they might never get another opportunity. Von Bock drove his men forward with increasing desperation. Frontline commanders urged their units onward despite mounting casualties and growing signs of collapse. The prize seemed so close. From some forward positions, German officers claimed they could see the spires of the Kremlin through their field glasses, glinting in the weak winter sun. Moscow, the city they had been marching toward for 5 months, was tantalizingly near. At the gates, the high water mark. The closest the Germans ever came to Moscow occurred in those final days of November and first days of December 1941. Several different German units reached points that would mark the furthest extent of their advance, the high watermark of the Nazi tide in Russia. These points, reached by different units at different times, represented the culmination of Operation Barbarossa and the moment when German prospects for victory in the east reached their zenith before beginning their long decline. North of Moscow, elements of the 2nd SS Division Das Reich pushed to within about 25 miles of the Kremlin, reaching the area around Lenino. The 7th Panzer Division fought its way to within approximately 22 miles of Red Square, approaching the village of Krasnaya Polyana, which today forms part of the town of Lobnya. German soldiers in these forward positions could indeed see buildings in the distance, though whether they could actually make out the Kremlin itself through the winter haze and from ground level remains a matter of debate. What is certain is that they were terrifyingly close to the Soviet capital. But the closest approach of all came at a place called Khimki, a small township northwest of Moscow along the Leningrad Highway. On the night of December 1st, 1941, a motorized reconnaissance unit from the 62nd Pioneer Battalion of the 2nd Panzer Division managed to slip through a gap in the Soviet defensive lines. Moving under cover of darkness, this small force of motorcycle combinations and light vehicles made their way along the highway toward Moscow. They were, by some accounts, searching for intact bridges over the Moscow-Volga Canal and the railway line, objectives that would be crucial for any German assault on the city itself. Exactly what happened at Khimki remains somewhat unclear, with different sources providing varying details about the size of the German force, the exact timing of their arrival, and what they encountered there. What seems reasonably certain is that elements of this reconnaissance unit reached the outskirts of Khimki, some sources saying they got as far as the railway station and bridge over the canal. They were now approximately 19 to 20 miles from the center of Moscow, from the Kremlin itself. This represented the absolute closest that German forces would ever come to capturing the Soviet capital. The German troops at Khimki found themselves in an extraordinary situation. They had penetrated deeper than any other German unit, reaching a point that was, for all practical purposes, within Moscow's outer suburbs. The township had tram connections to central Moscow. Soviet workers from the city commuted to factories in the area. These German soldiers were standing at what was essentially Moscow's doorstep. Some accounts, particularly from post-war German memoirs, claimed that officers with binoculars could see the golden domes of the Kremlin and the spires of Red Square's St. Basil's Cathedral in the distance. However, there are good reasons to be skeptical of these claims. The Soviets had taken extensive camouflage measures to protect Moscow from German aerial reconnaissance and bombing. The famous golden domes of the Kremlin had been painted dark colors. The distinctive red walls of the Kremlin had been painted to look like ordinary buildings with false windows. Camouflage netting and plywood structures had been erected on Red Square to confuse the street layout. Lenin's mausoleum had been disguised to look like a two-story residential building. Moreover, Moscow in 1941 was largely a low-rise city, but the intervening distance of nearly 20 miles and the presence of buildings and terrain features would have made seeing specific landmarks from ground level extremely difficult, if not impossible. More likely, what the German officers saw were reflections of sunlight off snow-covered roofs in the general direction of Moscow, or perhaps the towers and domes of churches and buildings in the nearer suburbs, rather than the Kremlin itself. It's also possible that in the exhaustion and stress of their situation, cold and far from their own lines, the soldiers saw what they wanted to see, convinced themselves that the gleam in the distance was their ultimate objective. Whatever the truth, the legend of German soldiers seeing the Kremlin from Khimki has persisted in historical accounts. What is not in doubt is that this small German force had reached a point of extreme vulnerability. They were a tiny island of Germans in a sea of Soviet defenders. They had outdistanced their support units and were cut off from reinforcement. They spent anxious hours at Khimki, waiting for the rest of their division to catch up, for infantry and tanks to arrive and consolidate their position. But that reinforcement never came. The German offensive had reached the absolute limit of its strength. Behind the forward units, exhaustion and winter had brought the German armies to a standstill. On December 3rd, Soviet forces counterattacked at Khimki. A hastily assembled force of local militia, supported by a handful of T-34 tanks from a reserve unit that happened to be in the area, struck at the German positions. The Germans, outnumbered and isolated, had no choice but to withdraw. They fought their way back through the gap they had come through and rejoined their own lines. The high water mark of the German advance had been reached and was now receding. Today, the point of the furthest German advance is commemorated by a memorial on the Leningrad Highway. about 23 kilometers from central Moscow. Erected in 1966 on the 25th anniversary of the Soviet counteroffensive, the memorial consists of giant anti-tank obstacles, known as Czech hedgehogs, standing like sentinels by the roadside. It's a stark reminder of how close the Germans came, and how close wasn't close enough. Interestingly, the memorial now stands next to an IKEA furniture store, a symbol of how much the world has changed since those desperate days of December 1941. The Iron Fist of Winter. By early December, the German offensive had ground to a complete halt along the entire front before Moscow. The men could go no further. In the northern sector, some units were within 12 to 15 miles of the Kremlin. In the west, German positions were within 25 miles of the city. But distance no longer mattered. The German armies had reached the end of their strength, the culmination of months of continuous combat, inadequate supplies, and the crushing burden of fighting in conditions for which they were utterly unprepared. The cold had become the Germans' worst enemy. December brought temperatures that regularly dropped to -30°C and below. German General Erhard Rauss, commanding the 6th Panzer Division, recorded temperatures in his war diary that reached -36 to -38°C during the worst period in early December. Other sources report even lower temperatures at various points along the front. Whatever the exact figures, it was cold beyond anything the German soldiers had experienced or prepared for. The human cost was staggering. Frostbite cases numbered in the tens of thousands. The German army would eventually record over 100,000 cases of severe frostbite during that first Russian winter, many requiring amputation. Men found that if they sweated during the day from exertion or combat and then cooled down at night, they faced an acute risk of freezing to death. Sentries had to be relieved every 2 hours or risk freezing at their posts. Wounded men who in summer would have had a good chance of survival now died within hours if they couldn't reach shelter. Sleep itself became dangerous. Soldiers had to wake each other regularly to ensure they hadn't frozen to death in the night. The equipment situation was equally dire. German tanks, magnificent machines that had conquered Europe, were reduced to immobile iron coffins by the Russian winter. Engines wouldn't start despite desperate efforts by crews to keep them warm. Some tankers tried lighting fires under their vehicles to warm the engines, a dangerous procedure that sometimes resulted in fires. Tank tracks froze to the ground overnight and had to be chipped free each morning. The narrow tracks that had given German panzers such excellent maneuverability on Western European roads and firm ground now proved inadequate in snow and ice, and tanks slipped and slid helplessly on frozen surfaces. Machine guns and rifles malfunctioned as their mechanisms froze or their lubricants turned to thick sludge. German soldiers learned to keep their weapons inside their clothing to prevent freezing, but this was only partially effective. The standard German stick grenade with its wooden handle often failed to function properly in extreme cold. Artillery pieces froze in place. Moving and aiming the guns required enormous effort, and the cold made the metal brittle and prone to cracking. Even ammunition was affected, with propellants burning less efficiently in extreme cold, reducing range and accuracy. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated the skies over Russia since June, found its operations severely curtailed. Aircraft sat on frozen airfields, their engines seized, their fuel lines frozen, their hydraulics inoperable. Ground crews worked in conditions that turned simple tasks into ordeals. Warming up an aircraft engine for takeoff required hours of work with blowtorches and heaters. Once in the air, aircraft faced the danger of engines failing from cold, controls freezing, and navigation becoming extremely difficult in winter storms. The number of sorties the Luftwaffe could fly dropped dramatically, just when the hard-pressed ground troops needed air support most desperately. Behind the front lines, the supply situation had deteriorated to a critical state. The German armies required approximately 120 trainloads of supplies per day to maintain normal operations. They were receiving only about 100 trainloads on a good day, and often far less. The primitive Russian rail system, with its different gauge from Western European railways, required all supplies to be transloaded at the border, a time-consuming process. Soviet partisan attacks on railway lines further disrupted the flow of supplies. The vast distances meant that even supplies that reached railheads then had to be transported hundreds of miles to the front by truck, and the trucks were breaking down at an alarming rate. The German soldiers at the front were acutely aware that they were at the end of a very long and very fragile supply line. Food became scarce. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel was precious. Medical supplies ran short. Requests for winter clothing went largely unanswered, not because the German Quartermaster Corps didn't care, but because adequate stocks simply didn't exist. The Wehrmacht had planned for a short war, a campaign that would end before winter. Now, winter was here, and the army was paying the price for that miscalculation. Zhukov strikes back. While the Germans struggled to survive in the bitter cold, the Soviets were preparing to strike. Stalin and Zhukov had been carefully husbanding reserves for weeks, gathering forces for a massive counteroffensive. Fresh divisions had been arriving from the Far East and Siberia. Troops who were accustomed to winter conditions and who came equipped with winter clothing, skis, and cold weather equipment. Intelligence from Soviet spy Richard Sorge in Tokyo had confirmed that Japan had no intention of attacking the Soviet Union in the near future, freeing these forces for use against the Germans. By early December, Zhukov had assembled a substantial reserve force around Moscow. Multiple armies had been created or reconstituted from the shattered remnants of units destroyed earlier in the campaign. These new formations included not just regular army units, but also militia divisions formed from Moscow's factory workers and citizens, naval infantry brigades transferred from the fleet, and cavalry divisions from the interior. In total, the Soviets had managed to concentrate over 1 million men for the defense of Moscow and the planned counteroffensive. The Soviet plan was straightforward, but ambitious. Rather than simply trying to push the Germans back from Moscow, Zhukov intended to strike at the overstretched German flanks north and south of the capital, aiming to encircle and destroy Army Group Center in the same way the Germans had encircled so many Soviet armies. It was a bold plan, perhaps too bold given the limited experience of many Soviet units and the shortage of tanks and artillery. But Zhukov was confident that the Germans were at the end of their strength and that a determined attack would shatter their overextended positions. On December the 5th, 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive began. Along a front stretching over 300 miles north and south of Moscow, Soviet armies attacked. The initial blow fell on the northern sector, where the Kalinin front struck at German positions around Kalinin. The next day, December 6th, the western and southwestern fronts joined the assault. Within hours, the entire front before Moscow had erupted in combat as Soviet forces attacked all along the line. The Germans were caught completely by surprise. German intelligence had assured the High Command that the Soviets had no reserves left, that they lacked the strength to mount any significant counterattack. The sudden appearance of fresh Soviet divisions, attacking with vigor and determination, shocked German commanders and frontline troops alike. These weren't the demoralized, poorly equipped Soviet soldiers the Germans had grown accustomed to fighting earlier in the campaign. These were fresh troops, many from Siberia, trained for winter warfare, equipped with skis and winter camouflage, supported by tanks and artillery. The Soviet offensive tactics were relatively simple but effective. Infantry units, often moving on skis through deep snow that immobilized German vehicles, infiltrated German positions and attacked from unexpected directions. Soviet cavalry, which the Germans had largely dismissed as obsolete, proved surprisingly effective in winter conditions, able to move across frozen ground and through forests where German mechanized units couldn't operate. Soviet tanks, particularly the T-34 with its wide tracks and diesel engine that functioned better in cold weather than German gasoline engines, provided mobile firepower that the Germans struggled to counter. The German response was hampered by the very factors that had brought their offensive to a halt. Troops exhausted from months of combat and weakened by cold and hunger had little strength left to resist determined attacks. Units spread thinly across wide sectors couldn't concentrate to meet Soviet penetrations. The lack of mobile reserves meant that Soviet breakthroughs couldn't be quickly contained. German tanks and vehicles that might have been used to maneuver against Soviet attacks sat frozen and immobile on the frozen battlefield. By mid-December, the Soviet offensive had achieved significant gains. In the north, Soviet forces had liberated Kalinin and were pushing the Germans back toward Rzhev. Around Moscow itself, the immediate threat to the city had been eliminated, as German forces were driven back from their closest approach positions. In the south, Soviet armies were forcing the Germans away from Tula and back toward the cities of Kaluga and Orel. The Wehrmacht, for the first time in the war, found itself in full retreat on a major front. The retreat was a nightmare for the German soldiers. Units withdrew through snow and ice, harassed by Soviet attacks and partisan actions. Men froze to death on the march. Vehicles and equipment that couldn't be moved had to be destroyed or abandoned. The orderly withdrawal that German training called for often degenerated into a scramble to escape Soviet encirclement attempts. Only the stubborn resistance of German units in key towns and cities, and Hitler's controversial order forbidding any major withdrawals, prevented the retreat from turning into a complete rout. By early January 1942, when the initial phase of the Soviet counteroffensive came to an end, the Germans had been pushed back between 60 and 150 miles from Moscow at various points along the front. The immediate threat to the Soviet capital was over. Moscow had been saved. Hitler's dream of capturing the city in 1941 lay shattered in the snow and ice before its gates. The turning point. The failure to capture Moscow represented far more than just a tactical setback for Nazi Germany. It marked a fundamental shift in the strategic balance of World War II, a turning point from which the Third Reich would never fully recover. The implications of the German defeat before Moscow reverberated far beyond the frozen battlefields of Russia. For the first time since the war began, Hitler's armies had been decisively defeated. The myth of German invincibility, carefully cultivated through 2 years of unbroken victories, lay in ruins in the Russian snow. German soldiers, who had marched from triumph to triumph across Europe, now knew the bitter taste of defeat. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. If the Wehrmacht could be stopped, if it could be pushed back, then perhaps it could be beaten. This realization would ripple through all the theaters of the war. The cost had been staggering for both sides. German casualties in the Battle of Moscow totaled somewhere between 250,000 and 400,000, killed, wounded, missing, or captured, depending on which sources one consults and how one defines the boundaries of the battle. The Germans had also lost enormous quantities of equipment, thousands of vehicles, hundreds of aircraft, and countless weapons that could not easily be replaced. Perhaps more importantly, they had lost irreplaceable veterans, experienced officers, and NCOs who had formed the backbone of the Wehrmacht's expertise. Soviet losses were even higher in absolute terms, with casualties likely exceeding 1 million, when one includes both the defensive and offensive phases of the battle. The encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk alone had cost the Red Army hundreds of thousands of men. But the Soviets could replace these losses in a way the Germans could not. The vast population of the Soviet Union and its mobilization capacity meant that new armies could be raised, new divisions formed, new soldiers trained. The Germans, fighting on multiple fronts and with a smaller population base, would find it increasingly difficult to make good their losses. The strategic consequences extended beyond Russia. On December 7, 1941, as the Battle of Moscow raged, Japanese aircraft attacked the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, bringing America into the war. 4 days later, on December 11th, Hitler compounded his strategic errors by declaring war on the United States, a decision that would prove catastrophic for Germany. The Führer now faced a coalition of enemies: Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, with resources that dwarfed Germany's own. The war that Hitler had hoped to win through swift, decisive campaigns had become a global struggle of attrition that Germany could not win. The failure at Moscow also marked the end of Hitler's confidence in his generals. The dictator blamed his military commanders for the defeat, refusing to acknowledge his own role in the disaster through his earlier diversion of forces to Ukraine and his prohibition on strategic withdrawals. Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief of the German army, was dismissed on December 19th, with Hitler assuming personal command of the Wehrmacht. This decision would lead to increasingly disastrous strategic choices as the war progressed, with Hitler's ideological obsessions and refusal to accept reality leading to one catastrophe after another. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Moscow provided a desperately needed boost to morale and confidence. Stalin and his commanders had proven that the Red Army could not only resist the German onslaught, but strike back and defeat German forces in battle. This knowledge would sustain Soviet resistance through the terrible trials that still lay ahead. The siege of Leningrad, the Battle of Stalingrad, the struggle for the Caucasus. The Red Army had learned lessons from its defeats, lessons in tactics, in organization, in how to fight the Wehrmacht. These lessons would be applied with devastating effect in the campaigns to come. The Battle of Moscow also revealed the fundamental flaws in the German plan for the conquest of the Soviet Union. Hitler's belief that the Soviet state would collapse quickly had proven false. The Soviet capacity for mobilization and resistance had been vastly underestimated. The logistical challenges of operating in Russia's vast spaces had not been adequately considered. The impact of weather and terrain on military operations had been dismissed. Above all, the Wehrmacht had failed to achieve its objectives within the narrow window of time before winter arrived. Now, having failed to knock the Soviet Union out of the war in 1941, Germany faced the prospect of a long war of attrition on the Eastern Front while also fighting Britain, and soon America, in other theaters. The war would grind on for 3.5 more years, years of unprecedented bloodshed and destruction. The Eastern Front would consume resources and lives on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. Millions more would die before the Red Army finally raised its flag over the ruins of Berlin in May 1945. But the seeds of that ultimate Soviet victory were planted in the frozen earth before Moscow in December 1941, when the German advance stalled at places like Khimki, when Soviet soldiers counterattacked through the snow, when Hitler's dream of a swift victory over the Soviet Union died in the Russian winter. Conclusion. The German advance on Moscow in 1941 stands as one of the most dramatic and consequential campaigns in military history. From the massive opening assaults of Operation Barbarossa to the final desperate attempts to reach the Soviet capital in the brutal cold of December, the battle encompassed every extreme of warfare. Brilliant tactical successes and catastrophic defeats, human courage and unspeakable suffering, triumph and tragedy on an epic scale. The furthest points reached by German forces, whether at Khimki just outside Moscow or at other locations around the city's perimeter, marked not just the high watermark of the German invasion, but a turning point in the Second World War and in modern history itself. If you found this examination of the Battle of Moscow valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Share it with anyone interested in World War II history or military history in general. And let us know in the comments what other aspects of the Eastern Front you'd like us to explore in future videos. Until next time, this is WW2 Unveiled, bringing you the stories of the past with all their complexity and human drama intact.